been a while since I've had an update on Alan Wake 2. My time finishing up the game has been a little bit fractured. That's largely thanks to real-world stuff, but it also turned out the game is pretty big, which is fantastic. I wasn't wanting the game to end anytime soon after my last update, but it's certainly taken longer to get to the end than I suspected. And what a wild ride it's been, especially the final sequence of chapters. I have to admit that, despite my best intentions, I wasn't very successful with my early plan of staying in character and sticking a bit more to the story objectives. Despite probably 30 plus hours of play, I want more, and the game may have it for me in some form. But let me keep that for the end. I played the remainder of the game much as I had the first 10 or so hours, exploring meticulously and conserving resources as much as I could. I was lured by secrets, exploring the remaining flooded areas as they opened up, and doing some significant backtracking after the Valhalla nursing home, where you finally pick up the bolt cutters. I returned to Bright Falls, Watery, and Cauldron Lake to explore previously inaccessible areas there, but ultimately stopped short of trying to find every lunchbox, manuscript page, and cult stash, out of interest in pushing the story through to its conclusion. Even so, there were very few things I left behind. The most notable one I skipped was accessing the Watery Lighthouse. One notable difference is that I started switching between Alan and Saga more readily, usually after each chapter. This mixed up the gameplay a little over the lengthy journey, and kept the details of what was happening to each of them fresh in my mind. There were ups and downs along the way. The Ocean View Motel sequence as Alan was an intense marathon. I wasn't sure I was ready for the cinema sequence after that, but they did an excellent job mixing things up in that area with the different environment, shorter length, and more psychological horror. The actual short film you can watch there is a unique touch and a nice change of pace, similar to the musical performance in the We Sing chapter earlier on. As Saga, exploring the Bunker Woods area that is initially flooded around Bright Falls had me over the combat for a while. The enemies in this area seem to respawn infinitely, which I hadn't noticed elsewhere. As I was trying to search the area, I kept running into groups of 3 or 4 tough enemies, including the ranged Taken that split in two and warp all over the place. Their thrown weapons would come flying through the leaves, tree trunks, and rocks, even if they seemed to block the path between us. As much as anything, this felt artificial and kind of broke the tension. Where were these enemies coming from? It was hard to feel like I'd fully searched this area because of the low light and dense brush, but it really wasn't that large, and enemies would show up from areas I just cleared. Ammo also seemed to drop from enemies at exactly the right time, probably ensuring I didn't run out completely. The inventory system continued to feel kind of buggy. Dragging items around was finicky. What was worse, my inventory started to seriously fill up as Saga, even the shoebox. This was largely due to her charms that I found couldn't be discarded. Unequipped ones took up slots. You also can't swap equipped charms in place. Only after unequipping a charm to an empty slot could you equip a new one. The inventory capacity issue came to a head when I revisited Watery and talked to Mayor Setter, who turned out to be a dog, on stage for a meet and greet at the community hall. This interaction awarded a charm, but my inventory was full. I got a message the charm went to storage, but when I checked my shoebox, it was also full, and there was no new charm to be found. It just vanished, seemingly, and I couldn't interact again to get it. I ended up reloading an earlier save, cleared a spot, and tried again, only to see that this charm is perhaps the most important one, at least for players looking to do everything. It reveals hidden items in your vicinity on the map. There are points in both Alan's and Saga's story where they must synchronize and wait for each other. Like the beginning of the game, events unfold from there in a set order. I hit this point of no return with Saga first, just after encountering Mr. Scratch. There's a good couple of hours to see things through from here, but this really signifies an acceleration in the story until the end. The first plot twist drops right around this time when it's revealed that Alan, whom Saga is trying to free from the FBC at the familiar Bright Falls Sheriff Station, is actually Scratch. Apparently Alan never escaped the dark place. The Cult of the Tree knew this and had been hunting Scratch, not Alan. Up until this point, I'd been feeling like Alan's story was predetermined. This threw that into question. It really got me wanting to switch back over and play his remaining chapters, which was super cool. First, though, I had to deal with Scratch. This turned out to be an exacting fight, and a bit of a puzzle to figure out. As Scratch came to life in front of me, I did what I'd been trained to do up until that point. I immediately popped a flare. I also started backing up, not sure where I had to go. I found the jail door behind me unlocked, fortunately, but it wasn't much help as Scratch completely ignored the flare and murdered me in 1 or 2 quick swipes. It took me a few more tries, and by that I mean gruesome deaths, learning a little more each time, before I understood what was going on. Scratch ignores pretty much every weapon you've got at your disposal, and you need to power up some banks of FBC super lights in the lot behind the jail to overwhelm him. This takes some time to do, and if you don't preoccupy him, he'll simply warp over and throw you down. Fortunately, loading some bullets into his head will force him to regenerate for a bit and give you an opportunity. Agent Estevez was yelling these sorts of details at me while I was fighting for my life, trying to avoid Scratch and figure out where I was and what I was supposed to do. I have to admit this kind of thing is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. When games throw you into a chaotic situation in which you have to do something, you don't quite know what that thing is, there's tons going on screen and someone is yelling instructions at you about what is going on and what you're supposed to do. It's kind of just information overload. Once I settled in and figured out the puzzle, it was a pretty cool sequence, finally confronting Scratch. Before proceeding beyond the point of no return with Saga, I switched back to Alan to see what was going to happen with him now that I knew he didn't escape the way I thought he did. Having finished exploring the cinema, it turned out there wasn't much more to do here than run back to Parliament Tower before I was kicked back to Saga again. This next part felt like it almost ruined the game for me. With the whole gang assembled on the shore of Cauldron Lake, Tor and Odin are set to rock out while I fend off a deluge of Taken supported by the agents up on a cliff with some pretty unreliable light sources. It's again a super cool sequence, but one that very quickly devolved for me into frustration. The number of enemies, their aggression, the number of bullets it took to take them out, combined with agonizingly long reload times, reset by frequent dodging of attacks. I didn't feel equipped by the game's combat mechanics to handle this. The flashlight was suddenly incredibly inconsistent dispelling the darkness from enemies. I'm not sure if they were buffed in this fight somehow, but frequently my flashlight boosts were not landing, and enemies seemed impervious if I tried multiple boosts in a row. Even trying to throw all the heavy weapons that I'd collected over the course of the game resulted in fumbling my hotkeys. I got knocked around by ranged enemies warping around me and throwing things I could only sometimes hear and hardly ever see. The tight or weird timing for successful dodging was much more apparent here with how frequently I was trying to do it. When the agents stepped in with their spotlights to stun everything, I had to use the opportunity to heal instead of reload or take enemies out. It seemed futile trying to fight this many enemies, and sure enough, it was. I had survived long enough on one of my attempts that I heard Agent Estevez say something about the Horde trying to take out the band, and that I should protect them. The game autosaves right as you start the Horde battle, but when choosing to load I found there was another autosave just before that allowed me time to play with my inventory and redo my hotkeys before triggering the event again. My idea now was to equip every big weapon and item that I had, and use them all. I also equipped all my coffee cup charms, the ones that return you to full health if you die, just in case. I lined the area around Odin and Tor with propane tanks. I took all the flashbangs, flares, and especially rocket flares that I had. I equipped all my weapons, but also didn't really plan to use them. The guns, I mean. I was going to see if I could just run around and distract enemies, then focus fire the dangerous ones as needed. I'm sure I got a bit lucky, but doing this was a completely different experience, and within like 5 minutes, it was over. I ran, avoided enemies as much as I could, and healed when I needed to. I lobbed a rocket flare into the big group at the end as it swarmed the band, and that was it. I'm really glad this didn't turn out to be as painful as it seemed it might be at first. I couldn't imagine doing this on hard or nightmare, if it was. Maybe it was just me, but I think the biggest flaw in this section is that the objective isn't clear from the start. I just defaulted to trying to kill things, and they kept coming and coming. The game ultimately prompts you on this, but I had to survive quite a while to even hear that. Following the craziness of the summoning fight, I had a few final opinions on the game's mechanics. Not infrequently, in a tight situation, it can feel like inputs get dropped. This might be things happening automatically or getting interrupted in fights, like when the flashlight is out of charges and automatically reloads, or you dodge and it interrupts healing or reloading. It's very noticeable, but hard to tell what the cause is. The flashlight boost can be really inaccurate. I came to think this had something to do with enemy proximity. If something is right in front of you, the flashlight aim seemed off. When enemies were further away, this seemed like far less of a problem. Intentional or not, it wasn't very intuitive. The hotkey system is somewhat flawed. I don't mind having only 4 hotkeys since you can assign 2 items to each, but I wanted the inputs required to select each item to be consistent. If you have another item equipped, you can press hotkey once to equip the first item in a group, and twice to equip the second. If you already have the first item in the group equipped, you have to press the hotkey just once to equip the second item in that group. If you only have an item in the second slot for a hotkey, you only ever have to press the hotkey once to equip it. Quickly switching to the right item is made more complex by this. It's pretty hard sometimes to tell what you have equipped in an intense fight, especially if inputs to swap may have been dropped or cancelled by other actions. I think I would have preferred to always press a hotkey once to get the first item and twice to get the second, regardless of any other context. While there's a final encounter with Scratch, with your training from the first fight back in Bright Falls, it's fairly straightforward, even if it is more demanding. What I'd really like to talk about to wrap things up is the story. Following the summoning, things don't quite proceed according to plan. Taking control of Alan again in the Dark Place, Parliament Tower can be reached for the final time. Here, Alan learns Alice's final fate. Tormented by Scratch in the darkness, she chose to commit suicide. Her final moments captured in stop action by her camera set on automatic, stepping off a cliff and plunging down, seemingly into a lake. Enraged by this, Alan rushes into the writer's room to confront Scratch, only to find that he stops himself from completing Return in the form he wanted. Time has no meaning in the Dark Place. It's not a loop. It's a spiral. Events repeat, but layer on top of each other, changing things. Alan is Scratch, seized by the dark presence. He drove Alice to kill herself, either as Scratch, or perhaps in just trying to connect with her across worlds and being turned into a monster by the lens of the overlap between them. Having fulfilled his apparent purpose, and locking in Scratch's version of Return, the dark presence chooses this moment to inhabit him and escape into the real world. Saga has rescued him, but it's Scratch and not Alan. He doesn't appear on the shore back at the summoning. He appears on the shore back at the end of Return 1, when Saga and Agent Casey think they're meeting Alan Wake, 13 years after his disappearance. Pretty cool, but it gets better. In the present, Scratch now has the clicker. Alan has been freed of the dark presence and needs to stop him from changing the world permanently. Saga has been thrown into the Dark Place, which I can't wait to play. Tor and Odin also walk into the lake after her. Seeing this, I immediately thought back to Alice walking off that cliff. It looked a lot like Cauldron Lake, the lake that she was dropping into. Is she alive in the Dark Place? I bet so. With Alan and Saga having swapped realities now, maybe we'll get to play as Saga in the Dark Place to help Alice. With an assist from the always mysterious Ahti, Alan reaches the real writer's room behind a final locked door on the top floor of the Valhalla nursing home. He and Saga hatch one final plan to try to fix the story, but there will be a price to pay. Jump to Saga in the dark place, a ringing phone, surely with Alice's voice on the other end when answered. Alice seems to know what's going on. Alice is the Deus Ex Machina the game itself referenced hours ago, providing Saga with the materials needed to end this, the clicker and a bullet of light. Where exactly these came from, who knows, but Saga is able to escape with them. As the credits roll, so many questions remain. I didn't feel entirely satisfied, until Alice speaks again. This part is just for you. I chose to return to the dark place. Alice as the mastermind. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't ending her life, at least not the way she led the world and Alan to believe. She alludes to contacting what must have been the Federal Bureau of Control. After her visit there, which is mentioned in the AWE expansion to Control, she remembers everything about the dark place. She knew Alan was trapped. She's organized this whole thing. There were still plenty of mysteries, but this final message really felt like a satisfying moment and a worthy payoff for me. Who or what is Ahti? Ahti was designated as special by the FBC in Control. He seems able to move in and out of the dark place. Others have now been revealed to have special powers in relation to the dark place, both the Andersons and the Doors. But what exactly can they do? What does that mean? What happened to Thomas Zane? This is a piece I need to pay more attention to next time through because I think I've forgotten some details. He's tricked by Scratch into helping him escape and then left behind, but from there, I don't remember. As Odin and Tor walk into the lake, they still call Alan Tom. I'm not sure why. Ahti also calls Alan Tom, in the dark place, and just outside the real writer's room. Sheriff Breaker remains trapped and seems linked to Warland Dor somehow, and Warland Dor himself has some motive and power unrevealed. There's a lot more here, perhaps for another game, or the final draft. Returning to the main menu after the credits, there's a new option. Selecting this, hard and nightmare difficulties are now unlocked. It seems like I'm starting a new game, but the first scene is noticeably different. I exit, leaving this for another day. The game has a few rough spots, but for the most part they don't cause too much friction. They were overshadowed by the good, in my opinion, and especially by the ultimate payoff of the story that the game builds slowly towards. This is my favorite Alan Wake game. I was skeptical from the start if it would challenge Control as my favorite Remedy game, but I think it's close enough I'm happy to say they're both awesome, and at the top of my list. They're certainly very different in key ways, but also intertwined. I'd love to see an Alan Wake 3 in this vein someday, but for now it doesn't seem I'm even done with this one, if the final draft mode promises even snippets of additional story. I guess we'll see how far it takes me, and whether I'll have more to talk about. Until then, or whatever next time may bring, thank you so much for checking out the video, and take care.